I was telling Rex earlier tonight that when I opened up to study my John lessons this week, I went to open my folder, my chapter 6 folder with my PowerPoints in it, and I had 4 in there, and I thought, oh, that doesn't look right. That looks like a mistake. And sure enough, I clicked on the first one, and it was over halfway through the chapter, and I'm missing 1 or 2 or 3 PowerPoints, and I have, just like with my other, I have no idea where those 2 or 3 PowerPoints are. Um, so I'm glad I did not look at the last moment, because I did have to recreate my lesson. It's good that I'd studied it before, but I don't have a PowerPoint for you. I had to choose between a PowerPoint or a recreation of my notes, and I didn't like the way it went last time as well, so I decided just to do a recreation of my notes. Um, we're in John chapter 6, verses 1 through 15 is what we're going to be looking at tonight. I'm going to go ahead and read that, and then we'll start looking at it. After these things, Jesus went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. Or Tiberias. A large crowd followed him because they saw the signs which he was performing on those who were sick. Then Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. Now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was near. Therefore Jesus, lifting up his eyes and seeing that a large crowd was coming to him, said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread, so that these may eat?" This he was saying to test him, for he knew what he was intending to do. Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread is not sufficient for them, for everyone to receive a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a lad here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are these for so many people?" Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." Now there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down in number about 5,000. Jesus then took the loaves, and having given thanks, he distributed to those who were seated. Likewise also of the fish, as much as they wanted. When they were filled, he said to his disciples, "Gather up the leftover fragments, so that nothing will be lost." So they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves, which were left over by those who had eaten. Therefore, when the people saw the sign which he had performed, they said, "This is truly the prophet who is to come into the world." So Jesus, perceiving that they were intending to take him away by force to make him king, withdrew again to the mountain by himself alone. All right. So I'm going to reread verse 1 again. It begins with, "After these things." Just a quick recap. What things is he referring to? Why do you suppose that Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee? Remember back. To get away from the crowds, but specifically, what crowd of people was he getting away from? What group of people was he getting away from? The ones he said wouldn't believe him, yeah, and specifically, most likely the religious leaders that didn't believe him. If you look back over in chapter 5, verse 18, it says the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him, because he not only was breaking the Sabbath, but also was calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. Well, remember, Jesus did not break the Sabbath. He broke the Sabbath according to them and their traditions. But Jesus understood what the true meaning of the Sabbath was, and what they called breaking the Sabbath was simply Jesus saying to a man, "Get up and walk," and which, of course, is not breaking the Sabbath. God did not break any, or Jesus did not break any of God's laws when he was on this earth. So, but they were seeking to kill him, and remember at the end of chapter 5, he went through all this list of things that we discussed in here, all the different means of testimony. He talked about his own testimony. He talked about the Father's testimony about him, John the Baptist's testimony. He basically compiled all this evidence that he was the Christ, the Son of God, and they still were rejecting him. So it's not Jesus' time to go to the cross yet, so Jesus leaves. So that's what John's referring to when he says, after these things, Jesus went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. This would be the north side of the Sea of Galilee. Verse 2, a large crowd followed him because they saw the signs which he was performing on those who were sick. So why did they follow him? To be healed. They saw, they followed him because they saw him heal people, and that's, John tells us that is the main motive for why the people were following him. Is that a good reason or a bad reason to follow Jesus? Human nature, yeah. It's, I don't know, go farther with that. Is good or bad? What do you think? Tom says good. Yeah. Yeah, he did. I mean, believe me, no one was twisting Jesus' arm. No one could do that anyway. No one could force him to do anything. But Jesus, multiple times in the Scripture, it says things, and I think we'll even see it tonight, where Jesus says, it says, moved with compassion, Jesus healed the people. He saw people that were hurting, and when Jesus saw people that were hurting from illness or for any reason, Jesus saw something that was never meant to be. No one is meant to hurt. No one is meant to feel pain or to have illness. No one is meant to die. When Jesus saw that, he saw a problem that he could correct very easily. So Jesus had compassion on the people, but it did serve a twofold purpose. Also, notice in Jesus' miracles, while they're all amazing, Jesus never did any big public miracles like the people wanted him to do. For instance, Jesus could have just flown. He could have just floated up in the air and flew across the sky. He could have pointed at a big rock and lifted it up like a Jedi in the Star Wars in the Force. He could have done stuff and that's what people wanted him to do. They wanted him to do stuff like that. I don't know why the miracles he did wasn't good enough for most of the people, because they're still miracles. They're still things that no one else could do. However, they wanted the sensational miracles. They really wanted to see him do things like Samson did and wipe out hundreds of soldiers, all by himself and things like that. So it's kind of a trick question. It's neither good nor bad why they followed him. If I saw somebody doing miracles, I'd probably follow him too for a little bit if I could and see what was going on. If nothing else, just out of curiosity. Verse 3. Then Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. Just one quick note here. The mountain in reference is in the same area that if you looked on a map today, you see this on the news all the time. This area where all this is taking place is what you hear on the news often is called the Golan Heights area. They're on the north side of the Sea of Galilee or Tiberias. And while it's a highly disputed area, dangerous area there now, this is where all this took place, which I think is just interesting to point some things like that out when they come along. So he goes up there. And it says, he went up on the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. Verse 4. Now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was near. This is very subtle, but when we ask the question, as we always should, why is this verse here? This passage that we're studying here has nothing to do with the Passover. And John just quickly references it real quick. He says that it was close, but he doesn't say anything in reference to it at all after that. He just says that it was close. So yeah, I have to ask the question, just out of my own curiosity, why does John tell us that? Well, remember that in chapter 5, in verse 1, John wrote, after these things, he likes to start chapters like that, or new paragraphs like that. After these things, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. So that's at the beginning of chapter 5, okay? Then we have here at the beginning of chapter 6, he says, the Passover was near, okay? So what's the point of that? Well, I think John is just keeping us up with the divine timeline of what's going on in Jesus' ministry. He's given us some notch marks along the way so that we can figure out how much time has elapsed in between his stories. It's most likely the Feast of Tabernacles, and the reason, or tents or booths, whichever one you want to call it, they're all the same thing. And because if that was the feast that he went up to Jerusalem, which they don't specify in chapter 5, then in chapter 6, it's close to the Passover. What that means is, and the significance of the verse, is that between chapter 5 and chapter 6, but in the turn of a page, a little less than 6 months has gone by. So these events that happen in John chapter 6 do not happen immediately after the events in chapter 5. We have a big gap of months in between there. If you want to know what goes on during those months, read Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They give you a lot more detail. John's hitting the high spots as he skips through the life of Jesus, saving the majority of his gospel for the last 2 weeks of Jesus' life. The first part of verse 5 says, therefore Jesus, lifting up his eyes and seeing that a large crowd was coming to him. I'll finish that. Said to Philip, where are we to buy bread so that these may eat? I love this because this is tricky Jesus at his best. I try to imagine these things. I don't know if that does me any good or not, but I try to imagine if Jesus had a little smile on his face when Jesus asked that to Philip. And I don't know why he picks out Philip individually here, that John tells us that. But for some reason, and he has his reasons, he picks out Philip and he asks him this question. Philip, imagine being out in the middle of nowhere. You have your disciples, and you've got this. Well, we know how many people because your little subtitle at the beginning of your chapter probably said the same as mine. Jesus feeds the 5,000. So we have a giant amount of people that have followed Jesus out to this area where they are. And imagine being with Jesus in this spot, and Jesus turns to you and says, hey, Randy, how are we going to feed all these people? I think I'd have probably looked at Peter and said, why don't you ask him, but, right, yeah. Go to Sonic, yeah.
Might be one of the reasons he talked about the Passover is because that would bring all these crowds into town that weren't always there, and they'd all be travelers far from home, and
Yeah.
that might all be part of this too, where it says therefore in verse 5, so the crowd has something to do with the Passover.
Yeah.
All these people weren't prepared to wander around the desert following Jesus.
Right. I think the insinuation there is it's just, like you said, it's just mobs of people, like these great big bunch of people. But attention has been drawn away from the travelers that are traveling to the Passover, which is going to be everyone in the land, heading south to Jerusalem. But Jesus has drawn their attention. Jesus is going to go to the Passover as well. So they've got time. Now, John doesn't tell us here, but Matthew, and I'm not going to do this too much, I promise, but I think a little bit of this is worth pointing out. John doesn't tell us what Matthew, Luke, and Mark tell us, respectively. Matthew tells us that Jesus, of this crowd of people, Jesus healed their sick. That's what Matthew tells us. Luke tells us that Jesus began speaking to that crowd about the kingdom of God. And Mark tells us that Jesus was moved with compassion for them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So that gives us a little bit more insight, pulling from the other Gospels, of some more of the details. It's interesting what John leaves in, what he leaves out. Despite Jesus knowing that the majority of this crowd would ultimately reject them, he still shows them all grace, which I think is incredible as well. He gives them a chance. What is about the only logical answer that Philip can give when Jesus asks him, how are we going to feed these people? Think, what's a logical answer to that question?
The other time when he fed a crowd, the answer was to send them away.
Yeah.
Send them away to go find their food, basically.
Yeah, I think that's right. Rex said the other time that the answer was from the disciples was send these people away. It's time to eat. Get these people out of here. Jesus, send them home, because there's no way to feed them. It's impossible to feed them. And I think that the logical answer for Philip would be to say, it's impossible, Jesus. There's no store I can go to, and even if there was a store I could go to, we don't have the money. There's no way we can do that. Now, verse 6 gives us that little insight here. This Jesus was saying to test him, to test Philip, for he himself knew what he was intending to do. So, tricky Jesus. Ask a question, but he already knows what his answer is. Jesus never asked a question because he wanted education. He didn't want information. It was always for a better reason, a more divine reason. Like the reasons that I ask my children questions. Yeah. Yeah, Philip knew. Philip from Bethsaida, he knew that there weren't any places to eat. But it was, as the scripture tells us here, it was a test. Jesus doesn't need Philip's help here, nor does he need Philip's input, but this is a test. So why ask the question? Why does he ask him? A test of what? Yeah, I think all of probably every single one of Jesus's questions that he ever asked was a test of faith question. Because, like I said, he knew the answers before he asked any question that he asked. The question is for the benefit of Philip, but it's also for the benefit of the other disciples. Now, imagine that you know what we know now. You know the future before it happens. What's the perfect answer if you're there that day and Jesus turns to you and says, how are we going to feed these people? What's the perfect answer to give him? The Lord will provide. Yes. Say, Jesus, why do you ask me? Nothing is impossible for you. That would have been the ideal answer when Jesus would have said, I have not found faith like this in all of Israel. But when Jesus makes statements like that, it's never about Jewish people, is it? It's the first person he said that about in the Bible was a Roman, if I'm remembering right. A Roman centurion. We also had the Gentile. They would have considered it a Gentile, but we had the Samaritan woman who had great faith. She believed Jesus. She understood that he had a power, and she put her faith in him. But not these yahoos that run around with him. That he's trying to. Now I call them yahoos, but these guys go on. They do learn eventually, but these guys go on to change the world. the whole world. We're here today because of them, because of the way that they spread the word to the Gentiles of the world. Verses 8 and 9. Oh, wait a minute. Verse 7. I'm skipping ahead. Philip answered him. So here's Philip's answer to Jesus' question. Philip answered him, 200 denarii, which would be about 8 months' wages. 200 denarii worth of bread is not sufficient for them, for everyone to receive a little. We can just politely call this, without beating up on Philip too much, a swing and a miss, okay? But what does Philip's answer tell us about Philip's faith? It tells us he has a little bitty faith, huh? Because Philip doesn't, Philip basically says to Jesus, it's not possible. What you're asking is not possible. And does Jesus still teach us the same way today? Doesn't ask us those questions directly, but does Jesus still test our faith today? Yeah, I think so. Daily, yeah. The questions are still here. Yeah, lots of questions, like Rex said, lots of questions we fail to answer right. It seems to me that I feel like a whole lot of questions that I've faced over the years, questions of my faith, have been situations I was in, that I found myself in, where it seemed that there was something that I had to pay, but it didn't seem that there was going to be enough money. Now, not all of the tests that I could point out in my life were like that, but I feel like I've faced several of those where I had to think. I don't think there's anything wrong with thinking when it comes to your faith, process things, and I remember, these days, whenever I face something like that, when I face some kind of a faith challenge to myself, where I feel my faith being tested a little bit, I'll say, in my prayers, I'll just say, Lord, I don't know exactly what you're doing right now, but but my faithfulness is going to stay committed, so whatever it is you need to teach me here, I just need you to know that I'm not gonna waver. I'm gonna stay committed. Go ahead, Sandy. Yeah. Yeah, it's good to know, though, that God, just like he was with Philip. No, God doesn't reprimand Philip. He doesn't say a single harsh word to him. He must have been disappointed, but he doesn't say anything harsh to Philip. This is a lesson for Philip, just like your situation was a lesson for you, so that the next time you come into a similar type situation, you can say, wait a minute, before I freak out, I'm going to pray. I'm going to say, Lord, I've been here before. You've been faithful in the past. You're going to be faithful in the future. Verses 8 and 9. One of Jesus' disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him. Let me just pause on that just for a second. Notice how John references Simon Peter as if the readers already know who he is. Now, imagine you're a first century Christian, you haven't read any of the other books of the Bible, and you're just reading this one. Well, that's probably not going to happen. I mean, but the group that he was writing to. But John wrote his last. He references Simon Peter, even he hasn't told us who Simon Peter is. The implication being that whoever's reading this is already going to know who Peter is, because Peter is a very famous apostle, the leader of the apostles. So, but it is funny that John references Peter, even though he hasn't told us anything. He hasn't told us. I don't know if he's told us anything about Peter yet. So anyway, he makes reference to Peter. He's assuming that we already know who he is. So here comes Peter to the rescue, you know. Philip has had a terrible answer. Let's see what Peter's answer is. Verse 9. Peter says, Andrew, I'm sorry. It's Andrew, Peter's brother. Still one of the top three, as I like to think of them. He says, there's a lad here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. Now, he's doing great so far. He's identified a kid who has some bread and some fish. So he says, look, there's this guy, he has these bread and fish. Now, Jesus, just multiply these and then everyone will be able to eat. Oh, but then he finishes his sentence. There is a lad here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are these for so many people? Womp, womp. He starts strong but finishes miserably. There's a quote that's often attributed to Abraham Lincoln that says, it's better to remain silent and be thought a fool than to speak out and remove all doubt. Well, it's always attributed to Abraham Lincoln, but it's only because Abraham Lincoln was truly a man of the Scriptures. What Abe Lincoln was roughly quoting was Proverbs 17, verse 28, which says, even fools are thought wise when they keep silent. With their mouths shut, they seem intelligent. I do try to remember that. It doesn't work out for me very well, but I do try to remember that from time to time. Verse 10. So what's Jesus going to do about this? No one's going to be fed based on the faith of his disciples. I can assure you that. Verse 10, Jesus said, have the people sit down. Now there was much grass in the place. So the men sat down in number about 5,000. Now, listen, church, there is a golden principle here. And I love this because this is stuff I can grab a hold of with both hands. When your faith is failing you, remain obedient. They don't understand what's going on. His disciples don't. But when Jesus says, have the people sit down, they go out and they have the people sit down. They don't tell them to, even though they're probably all thinking this is a bad idea. Well, I don't know what's going to happen here, but I don't understand this. Why I say that's a golden principle is because how often in life do we not understand? But we do have the ability, even in our lack of understanding, which a lot of times can amount to a lack of faith, but we still can be obedient, even if we don't understand. Or even if our faith stinks, I can still be obedient. It's kind of like it's doing the right thing for the wrong reason, or the misunderstood reason, so to speak. But you trust the Lord. You trust the Lord. So you do it anyway. Why do you suppose John adds that detail that there was a lot of grass? Seems like a weird thing to say. Why would someone say that? Yeah, that's part of it as well. I mean, if for nothing else, Lindsay, it's so that we'll pay attention, and specifically to John's testimony. Now, if John were not there, if this were not an eyewitness account, there would probably not be details listed within the text. Like in the book of Acts, where when Luke was living in another city, where Paul had left him, he had to get a lot of information from Paul or those traveling with Paul about the things that Paul did in the other cities. Well, Luke includes those in the book of Acts. But then when Luke rejoins the Apostle Paul on his missionary journey, when they start heading home, then we see the details, if we pay attention, we see the details come back into the text. Because when you are an eyewitness of something that happened, you'll remember. And it's just in John's memory. John remembers, I remember that place as he's recording this. There was a lot of grass in that area, so it was a good place to sit down to have a meal. But it's not a detail that someone who was not an eyewitness would have included in their story. And I think if nothing else, that's just a good reason. See, it's just a further proof that John was there and this is his testimony. And John says in the end of the book that his testimony is meant to make us believe, and having believed, ultimately receive our salvation. I'm sure you've heard this before, but notice that it says that the men were in number of about 5,000. That doesn't mean that there was just 5,000 guys out there. What that means is they counted, did a rough count of the men that were in the crowd so that they could actually get a count. There are also women and children there. So the number of those who are actually fed is unknown, but it's much larger than 5,000. Estimates usually range around 15,000 is what who Jesus probably actually fed in these traveling families. Verse 11. Jesus then took the loaves, and having given thanks, he distributed to those who were seated. Likewise also of the fish, as much as they wanted. A quick reminder to ask God to bless the food before you eat it. I'm just joking, but he does do that before they eat every time we have it recorded. However, he doesn't always wash his hands. So, you hand washers out there, don't worry about that. Jesus said it's okay. He also said it's not what goes into your mouth that defiles you. It's what comes out of your mouth that defiles you, but he's just talking about sin. Now, if you don't wash your hands, you may get diarrhea or something. So, anyway, just a word to the wise. I'm full of useful information. The other Gospels tell us that Jesus had the disciples distribute the food to the people. If you only read John's account, it sounds like Jesus passed out all that food. The other accounts tell us that no, Jesus told the guys to get these empty baskets and fill them up with fish and bread, and then they went and distributed them out. And I don't want to make too much of this, but I also want you to be aware that when God provides, he completely fills you with whatever you need, like he does to these people. That all the people eat to their full satisfaction. Verse 12. When they were filled, he said to his disciples, "Gather up the leftover fragments so that nothing will be lost." So they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves which were left over by those who had eaten. Verse 12, it is subtle, but what's the significance of those? Oh, wait a minute. Am I skipping something here? Oh, yeah. What's the significance of Jesus telling his disciples, gather up the leftover fragments so that nothing will be lost? What's this tell us about Jesus? He's not wasteful. Right. You can find that principle throughout the Old Testament as well when you read the Scripture. But what the sacrifices of the animals and the bread and everything had specific uses, and everything was done very efficiently. God is not a God of waste. in Jesus, the Son of God is not a God of waste. What's the significance of the 12 baskets of leftovers? One for each disciple. 12, he's teaching 12 guys. Primarily, he's teaching 12 guys. 12 lessons for 12 guys. Here's each of you, every single one of you gets your own faith lesson. 12 baskets. I also heard someone say one time, notice that Jesus makes 13. So there's Jesus and there's 12 apostles. They have 12 baskets. So someone is going to have to think to share with Jesus later. He doesn't need them to share. He can, like Jesus said to him before, I have food of my own that you know nothing about. Verse 14. Therefore, when the people saw the sign which he had performed, they said, this is truly the prophet who is come into the world. Like, wow, have the people finally seen the light? They are calling Jesus the prophet, the one that was spoken of by Moses. They're calling him the Messiah. It sounds like a bunch of these people have finally got on the right page. But things aren't always what they seem. Verse 15. So Jesus, perceiving that they were intending to come and take him by force to make him king, withdrew again to the mountain by himself alone. What did those people see when they saw Jesus? A free vending machine. We don't have to work anymore. We've got a guy who can feed us all the time, miraculously. And who can defeat an army that doesn't have to provision itself? So they intended to force him to be the king, and all that's on their mind is free food. And Jesus goes on to say that to him later, so that's not just my own speculation. I'm just reading ahead. They see someone who has the potential to overthrow Rome. That is what's on their heart. That's what's on their mind. And we're going to see very soon, they are missing the point. If you want to read ahead for next time. That is our lesson for tonight. Of course, we always offer an invitation if anyone has a reason to respond for any reason. Feel free to come forward as we do that, or as we sing the song. If it's convenient for you, let's stand as we sing number 679.